Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Live with Colledge, the Persnickety process, a closer look at highly selective admissions, part of our college admissions literacy series designed to bring parents and families better information about higher education and better access to college admissions. I'm James Hayashi, the admissions manager at Colledge, and I'm really excited about tonight's session. Our goal tonight is to demystify the admissions process at schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and show you how they actually read applications and understand what those teeny admit rates really mean. By the end of this live session, you'll have insights that may change the way you choose the schools on your college list. Specifically, we'll unpack the inner workings of highly selective college admissions, share more about the top 3 institutional priorities at these colleges, empower you to make informed choices about best right fit schools, and give you College's signature college list workbook to help you hone in on a balanced, best right fit list of colleges. First, a couple notes before we get started. This session is being recorded and we'll send a recording out to everyone. And so we encourage you to just be present and listen. If you're happening across our broadcast on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, I'm gonna pop our Eventbrite link into the comments box right now. Just fill out that form and we'll send you the recording. Our hope is to provide you with information you need. So please hit like if you're finding this information useful so we know how we're doing. Also, I want to encourage everyone to please feel free to pop questions at any time into the comments box on your streaming platform as we go. I'll keep an eye on the comments and address your questions at the end of the session. And as I alluded to earlier, we do have a great giveaway for live viewers, the college list section of our signature college guide, which we'll be giving away towards the end of tonight's broadcast, so stay tuned. Before we do any of that stuff, I'd like to welcome Kelsey Tarosian, our Director of Admission Services here at Colledge.
Hi, James.
Hey, Kelsey.
So nice to be here. I'm really excited to do this with you tonight.
So, Kelsey, we've all heard terms like selective, highly selective, maybe ultra, uber, unbelievably selective. I'd like to start us off by pausing to define a bit, what do these terms actually mean in the admissions world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a great place to start, James, because it kind of, this idea of just, oh, it's selective or it's highly selective. It's what does that even mean? And it's kind of a panicky feeling when you're thinking about applying to college. So generally speaking, and for the purposes of our conversation tonight, a selective school is a college that admits about 50% or less of its applicants. In contrast, then, a highly selective institution is any institution that has an admit rate of about 15% or less. But of course, there's another infamously selective top tier on top of that, which we're going to refer to as the Ivy Plus schools, so named because they include, of course, all of the traditional Ivy League universities, Brown, Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth, Harvard, UPenn, Princeton, and Yale, plus places that are in that same echelon of selectivity, such as MIT, Caltech, and Stanford. The Ivy Plus colleges now have an admissions rate that's pretty close to 5% across the board. Yikes.
5%. Yikes. So like about as likely as my mom coming over to visit and not criticizing something about my house.
Yeah. So the other way to think about it, James, is that you have a 95% chance of not getting in. So not to be negative, but just, they're tough schools to get into.
Of course. But seriously, Kelsey, before we go any further, we should take a moment to dispel a myth that develops among many families when they hear a number like 5%. It's something that some of you watching right now might be thinking. The common fallacy is that if a school has a 5% admit rate, each applicant has a 5% or like a 1 in 20 chance of getting in. What does 5% really mean?
Yeah, it can feel really random. And that kind of myth, I often refer to it as kind of the lottery illusion, the lottery myth. When it gets so small in a percentage likelihood of happening, it feels like it's kind of a crapshoot. But honestly, for tonight, if you walk away knowing nothing else, learning nothing else, I want you to walk away from tonight's discussion knowing that the more selective a school is, actually, the more intentional they have to be in their admissions process. So at the most selective level, it's quite literally anything but random. And just to give you a better sense of what I'm even talking about, I want to use Harvard as an example. So oftentimes it can be actually pretty hard to unpack exactly how some of these really highly selective schools go about their admissions processes. But because of certain things happening in our legislative system with regards to Harvard, Harvard has needed to open the doors to its admissions process for examination. So I can share a little bit more about their actual process. In effect, Harvard has developed an internal rating system. So what they do is they assign an academic, extracurricular, athletic, and a personal rating to every single applicant that's on a scale of 1 to 4. And this is actually a moment that I'll pull out because these things are elements that are looked at pretty much every school. Even if they don't have a rubric that looks just like Harvard's, if they don't have an admit rate just like Harvard's, they will be looking at students in terms of their academic success, their extracurricular involvement, athletic if applicable, and also what else they've done, their personality, things like that. So at Harvard, what they do is they give the student a rubric score, 1 to 4, where 4 is actually the lowest possible score and 1 is the strongest possible score. To give you even more context about these ratings, typically in a given year, less than 1% of all of their applicants receive a score of 1 in any one of the 4 areas, let alone more than 1. That's of their 57,786 applicants in 2020, 2021. That's, around 500, a little bit more than that. And so we'll dig into a little bit more about what these ratings a little bit later. But essentially what the system tells us is that each of these schools really is very intentional in the way that they go about evaluating their applicants, and that their admissions process is anything but random. So based on a student's application, looking at those 4 areas, some students who rate closer to a 4 actually have basically a 0% chance at the Ivy Plus colleges or any other highly selective. And based on those same factors, other students have a better or much better than that 5% chance of admissions. And just to make a note, Harvard was actually closer to 3.5% this year. So we're not actually talking about 5% with Harvard, but with just in general, these schools are all around 5% plus or minus 2%. So now you might be thinking, okay, cool. So the hacks who totally don't have a chance get 4s and don't get in, and the students who have worked really hard might have a chance.
But there's a problem with that thinking too, of course. Harvard explicitly states that, this is from their own language, quote, most applicants are academically qualified to attend Harvard. Wow. And scores of candidates apply with near perfect GPAs and test scores. In fact, Harvard also said, quote, more than 8,000 applicants for the class of 2019 had perfect GPAs, about 3,500 had perfect SAT math scores, and nearly 1,000 applicants had perfect ACT and or SAT composite scores. Last year, to kind of look at the numbers again, Harvard received about 61,000 applications, and of those, over 52,000 could have made the cut just based on their grades and test scores alone. But Harvard needs to trim that down significantly to get to the 1,200 or so offers of admission it ultimately sent out. So at Harvard, even dismissing the nearly impossible academic rating of 1, let's look at what a 2+ rating could look like. And Harvard says an applicant receiving a 2+ academic rating is typically an applicant with a perfect or near perfect grades and testing, but no evidence of substantial scholarship or academic creativity.
Let me pause you for 1 second, James.
Sure.
I would argue that attaining perfect or near perfect grades and test scores is a pretty substantially scholarly achievement in and of itself. And that's why I want to pull that out for a second, because they're saying that's a 2+. That's a strong student, right? But that is not a student who's going to be even more than a 50-50 shot of getting in.
Yeah, so kind of to differentiate that 2 from 1, an applicant with a 1 rating has submitted academic work of some kind that has to be reviewed by a faculty member. So literally, this is a high school student submitting some kind of project or club or committee that they were in that was so elevated that you literally need a PhD to come and review it to explain what the student did.
Amazing. The fact that there are students out there that are doing that level of work is pretty mind-boggling in and of itself. But I do think that it's a really important moment to just slow down and look at that. So I do actually want to zoom in even further. And I want to take a look at 2, of course, completely redacted transcripts from students that we've worked with in the last couple of years. So All right. So hopefully you can see this. I know it might be a little small, especially if you're watching on your phone. So I'm going to zoom in and we'll kind of take a look at this transcript. I can see that this particular student right here, what you're seeing where I'm hovering my mouse is actually uh, a course that they took before high school started. I see that we've got Algebra 1, the students putting themselves ahead. They did okay, they got Bs. And I actually see that for the most part, we've got a student who has pretty straight A's. Like, I would call this near perfect. I see that they put themselves ahead. In freshman year, they are already in geometry. They're doing really well. They've got 3 honors courses, not English, biology, and world history. Great. And then we move into sophomore year. We have 2 honors. We've added in an AP. So upping the rigor a little bit with a little bit of a harder curriculum. Still doing pretty well. Got a B, but that's okay. And then sophomore year finished strong. Junior year comes around, upping it a little bit with AP, 2 APs, 2 honors, still getting lots of A's. I see we're getting into physics and pre-calculus, and this was a STEM student. And finally, I see that planned courses for senior year include 4 APs and no honors courses. So what are your thoughts about this student, James?
Sounds like a winner to me. I mean, again, you noted that pretty much straight A's, just a couple B's here and there. They
Mhm.
started really, even in junior high, preparing with those slightly more advanced courses.
Mhm.
Um, Even in senior year, definitely not sliding into like slacking off, but taking
Not
a
at all.
significant number of APs.
Mhm.
So seems like actually a pretty good candidate, even for a highly selective school.
Yeah, and you would think so. The student also had a really strong SAT score. But one thing that I'll point out is that this is a STEM student. And across the board, STEM admissions, especially at the highly selective, the admit rate goes way down if you're talking about STEM. So now I'm going to bring up another student. And you'll see that this person's transcript looks a little different, but not that different. So I'm hoping you all can see, as the same as before, this upper quadrant is pre-high school. So already I actually see one thing I'll just note is that this student's school gave number grades. These are, you can think of them like percentages, where 100 is the perfect score and anything down to 90 is an A. So the first thing I'll note is that there's nothing that's down past 90. The closest to a 90 that the student ever got was the first semester of honors geometry that they took in addition to both semesters of Algebra 1 and both semesters of Spanish 1. I can also already see that the student is an athlete and they still did really well. So already before ninth grade, the student has pulled ahead, even in a small way. So now they're finishing up geometry and they're in Algebra 2 already in freshman year. We've got 3 honors in freshman year. I can see the student is, like I said, still an athlete. Then going into sophomore year, we are upping the ante. So instead of 1 APs that we saw in the previous, we see 2 APs, and we also see 3 honors. So this student is actually really starting to pull ahead of the other one. Now, finally, in junior year, this student had honors calculus. So they made it all the way to this honors level calculus. They have 1, 2, 3 APs. They've got 2 honors classes. They still do lacrosse. So at this point, there's already no regular level classes. And then I can tell you there was a really strong, ended up in advanced math in senior year. And this is not a student who is necessarily going into STEM. So what I'll tell you now that we've gone through both, even though this may seem subtle, there's 2 key differences. One is that the first student was not accepted to the multiple Ivy League and Ivy League adjacent schools that they applied to. But number 2 is that second student was a recruited athlete. And that makes a big difference. So, not a STEM student, a little bit stronger academically, recruited athlete, and he actually got a commitment out of Harvard and chose a different school. Surprising that though that may seem, that that they felt that the student felt more connected to. So just to show you how tight it can be, both students had really strong test scores, and it's all about the subtleties of other things, the other ways in which a student differentiates themselves. The student also, the first one had a lot of pretty traditional activities going on. The second one had a lot of community service, and it was a deep value of his. And I think all of those things is what ended up, plus obviously his incredible athletic talent, ended up with a recruiting commitment from Harvard. So you can see that at these schools, it really isn't enough to just do perfectly in high school and have a great SAT and ACT score. You really do need that hook. And that brings me to what we call institutional priorities. These are the things that any school is focused on generally, or also in any specific year. You could kind of think of them like the school's personal values and its goals. And when it comes down to it, while these schools, these Ivy Plus schools that we've been lumping together, we're going to differentiate them a little bit more in a moment. These Ivy Plus schools really vary very widely in personality and culture and values. Some of them almost couldn't be more different from one another, except for their selectivity. There are some priorities that all of these kind of unbelievably selective schools basically share. Number one, the most important thing is scholarship. They want to see that you are a student who is going to be able to succeed on their campus, but that you also have taken it a step further. Number two is passion and contribution to one's community. Whatever the form is, that's what they're looking for. And number three, the third most important institutional priority that all of these schools share, is their commitment to diversity and social responsibility and their awareness of that. And the thing is that's tricky. It's not enough that a student has these qualities, that they have this potential, that they think about these values, that they participate in them in small ways, that they care about social justice or diversity or their community. Applicants must provide significant evidence of already having engaged in them in ways that admissions officers can recognize, and often in ways that have changed the world already, that have changed their community, that have changed their schools. We're talking about students who have already had an impact.
And not to add more stuff onto the stack, but
come on.
All right. Beyond that perfect point 4.0, beyond what Harvard calls evidence of substantial scholarship, and that hook that you mentioned, whether that's something like being a recruited athlete or being a legacy student, each of these highly selective schools is looking for something a little bit different in its students. So I know we've been using that umbrella term Ivy Plus to kind of lump them together, but the schools are, like you said, Kelsey, really unique, just as every student applicant is unique. So kind of to dive into what that means more specifically, for example, a place like Vanderbilt is inclined towards students who've demonstrated leadership in their spheres of influence, teens who've helped others and have risen to the top in whatever field they're passionate about. Mm-hmm. In contrast, Stanford wants what they call disruptors, people who will innovate and change society, breaking things as they are to create something that's new. Dartmouth looks for intellectually curious, creative students who are focused on studies, but also don't take themselves too seriously. And a school like UChicago is looking for competitive applicants who are singularly driven in a specific area and have risen to be the very best at that. They want students who have proven that they take learning far beyond the classroom just because they want to, not because they had to.
Mm-hmm. That's such great differentiation. And I know it's just a drop in the bucket for all of you listening out there, but it really is important to realize that, UPenn is really, really, really different from Brown. And I know that that's an exaggerated example, but it's true that each one of these schools is a very different personality. And I want to kind of pause for a minute and tell you a little bit of something. By itself, knowing what each Ivy League school or highly selective school or honestly any college is looking for and where their institutional priorities lie, just knowing that isn't going to really help you with that offer of admissions, because you can't actually fake it in front of admissions officers. Imagine that you are reading literally hundreds, probably thousands of applications and essays. You start to get a sense that's pretty clear about when an application has been kind of constructed to make an avatar of yourself that you're kind of hoping is going to get you in. And I'll tell you something, it's just not, as a former admissions reader at a highly selective college, it is not as subtle as you think. And it's also not as interesting as you are or as your child is. So what does this mean? Does that mean that everything you've learned tonight is useless? No. What I want you to know is that by reaching deeply into the values and offerings of any institution, you can begin to understand which fit you or your child if you're a parent as a student. And when we work with students at Colledge, our job really is to identify who a student is at their core and help them find the colleges who fit the student. And I really wish that I could go out there and break the mold of this kind of paradigm of trying to fit yourself into a college that you think you want. The college is there to serve the student, right? And the college gives you an opportunity, but in the end, you are the one that chooses the college. And so I really want to encourage parents and students out there to really think about who is the student, where is the fit academically and in every other way, and then find the college that fits the students. What we do then is help students shine in the admissions process, not because we're making somebody who can't get into Harvard get into Harvard. I can't do that. Nobody can do that. But I mean, ethically, nobody can do that. But rather to show the student who they are to the college in a genuine, really poppy, shiny way that's true to the student. So it is all about identifying who the student is, what they've actually done in the expression of that identity. And once the student has a really clear sense of their own identity, who they are, what their characteristics and values are, what they would fight for, they can narrow in on the schools that will celebrate that identity and welcome the applicant with open arms for all that they have to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Because of that, because we're looking for that pairing of who the student is and what the colleges prioritize, I often liken the college search process to matchmaking. You don't want to just like close your eyes and kind of point to someone randomly and hope that they'll agree to go on a date with you, right? First, I think it's helpful to understand who you are, what you're looking for in that date, and then specifically go after people or colleges who have the characteristics you want and who are interested in the strengths that you're bringing to the table. Admissions into one of these ultra selective schools is not just unlikely, it's limited to those like extreme outliers. So if we're not recommending that most students apply to these schools, why is it helpful to understand admissions at these highly selective places? So some takeaways that I think are broadly applicable no matter where you're looking, no matter where you're applying. First, pretty much every college is invested in its brand name, its reputation. So every college is looking for students who aren't just going to come and take in, absorb, and learn. They want students who are looking to serve and to give back on the college campus, right? The colleges are thinking about students who are going to carry forward that college name. Second, colleges are basically all looking for the same type of stuff. First being your academic profile, like are you ready for college on their campus? Your extracurriculars, what do you have to give? What are you already passionate about and involved in? Of course, your essay, like who are you going to be at our school? And of course, those hooks that we alluded to earlier, whether they're athletic, musical, artistic, related to research, diversity, or legacy. And then thirdly, all schools are making a judgment call based on the evidence that you send in your application.
And I really want to, that's such great takeaway information, James. And I really want to underline this idea of evidence. All colleges are interested to see what you're interested in. They want to hear what you care about, but they then want to know, okay, that's awesome. So then what did you do about it? And so that's, if you are a little bit younger, that's what I want you to think about, is not trying to tick boxes, not trying to do the things you've heard from somebody is going to get you into college, but doing the things that are tethered to your passions and what you care about. And so the last note on the Ivy Plus and the Ivy League schools, the highly, highly selective, uber unbelievably selective schools, they're all concerned with diversity and access, right? The reality, however, is that they themselves can't really move the needle when it comes to educational access because they have tiny admit rates and their size is limited. But what they can do is have a major impact on educational trends and educational policy. So in the world of fashion, we might all look to Gucci, for example, to forecast trends. In the world of education, the Ivy Leagues, the highly selectives, and actually the University of California system are the ones that other schools look to set up that future of higher education. And I actually just had the awesome opportunity of being up on Stanford's campus and having an amazing afternoon, delightful conversation with one of my colleagues up there. And I have to say, they have done amazing work with diversity. It's an incredibly diverse, beautiful campus. So is that work done there? No. Their work now is to make sure that students of color who've joined their campus are actually supported, to make sure their staff and faculty are just as diverse as their student body. And hopefully these highly watched, scrutinized, famous selective schools, as they begin to work hard to role model, or as they continue to work hard to role model supportive educational policy and best practices, other schools will follow suit, and their success, the highly selective and UC's success at doing so, will forecast our collective future.
Thanks. And before we dive into the questions from everyone watching, I want to make sure to provide the link to that giveaway I mentioned earlier. It is our College List Development Guide. The link will be available till tomorrow at noon, so be sure to download it right away.
Great. Thank you, James.
So you may have specific thoughts, everyone out there listening, and questions, which is great, and we're trying to get to as many as we can. If you have more questions or feel like you need help with research or thinking about schools, please reach out to us directly. I'll give you our contact link also in the chat right now. And to get us started, there's a question. How can families use like these admit rates, like 5%, 10%, whatever they are, to think about where to apply, and more importantly, to guide their understanding of where a student might actually get in?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and such important kind of unpacking that needs to happen. So there are really two, if I'm being like really general and really broad. And as I talk, I want to encourage everybody to please pop any questions you have into the comments box on your respective social media streaming platform. But as you look at, whether you're going to get in, we call that tagging, right? You might, at your high school, your counselor might have, target and reach schools, or likely schools, or backup schools. At Colledge, we call them likely, possible, aspirational, or not likely. And the two major factors that go into that are the school's admit rate, and at the same time, their mid 50 percentile of who they admit in terms of their academic, overall GPA, their academic profile, and their test scores, if applicable. And while I will say that it's more of an art than a science, in general, if it's, 50%-ish or more of an admit rate, schools are looking for reasons to admit a student. If it's less than that, if it's qualified as a selective school, if it's 40% or lower, they are, more looking for reasons to deny, to be kind of frank about it. That's a little bit of a black and white way of saying it. But so you want to look, as you think about selectivity, you want to factor in that admit rate, because if you have a 5% admit rate, it almost doesn't matter how perfectly you've done in high school. It's still going to be not likely that you're going to get in. Now, obviously, some people do get in, and I don't want to be overly, negative or pessimistic there. But just, you have to think about it as you balance your list. And then you want to think also, okay, so if this school has a 20% admit rate, you would want to be well within the mid 50 percentile of what they say that most students have, GPA wise and test score wise. If you are significantly above, that makes it easier for you, or more likely for you to get in. If you are significantly below, then you really do want to consider the factors of academic fit and whether you have a chance or not, and therefore whether it's worth the work of the application, which, especially at the highly selective level, you end up with a whole lot of supplemental essays. So there is a lot of work that goes into every single application.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much work that goes into every application. Another question that I hear a lot is something like, is it true that if you're a legacy student, you're basically guaranteed admission at some of the schools we've talked about or other places? And maybe before you answer that, if we could I'll define that term.
Yeah.
So not everyone maybe has even heard of like legacy, but so that's basically if a family member has gone to a specific college before you or before your son or daughter, then that applicant is considered a legacy at that school. It's also important to know how each college defines legacy can vary from place to place. So some places say it's just your parents or your grandparents, and if they went here for undergrad, right? None of the professional schools like med school, law school. Some places will count siblings. So if your sibling went here, then you're a legacy, or aunts and uncles. That term varies from place to place. And then two, Kelsey, is that even true? Like if you're a legacy, you just get this big leg up on everyone else.
For the most part, no, it's not true. For the most part, the legacy piece comes in towards the end of the conversation as more of an awareness that schools have of who is applying and how they're already connected with the university. I liken it sometimes. I mean, and like I said, I really want to kind of temper my answer here because all colleges think about it differently. All colleges deal with it differently. Some do not consider legacy at all, even in the highly selective echelon of admissions. But typically what it looks like is if a student is a highly qualified, very competitive applicant and they have legacy, that may be a small part of the conversation. That's typically how it works for most students. So I kind of think about it as like an extra piece of almost like demonstrated interest. It's an established connection with the school. And I also just want to make sure that all of you heard what James said, which is number one, that graduate programs generally are not counted as legacy. So even if your parent went to UPenn for, I don't know, their MBA, that isn't going to be counted as legacy in the same way as it would have if they went as an undergrad. And then the second thing is that some schools, actually UPenn is one of them, only will count direct lineage descendants. So parents, grandparents, that's it. No siblings, no aunts or uncles, nobody else. Other schools, it's like anybody who's related to you who went to the school that counts as that connection. So it's certainly, for the most part, by and large, is never going to be a guaranteed admission for anyone just because you have legacy.
Yeah, so super helpful to know, especially if you think that you have that kind of advantage, but it doesn't actually exist based on their definition. So this is kind of the time of the year, obviously, where people are thinking about putting their lists together and deciding where they're going to apply, or at least where they're going to visit and look at. There might be people who have a question like this. If I apply to a lot of these, like most selective schools, these Ivy Plus, highly selective places, and to kind of balance things out, I'm applying to a couple backups. Like that should be a good list, right?
It's a balanced list, right? Yeah, sure. Technically it's balanced, and that will tell you like, yeah, you're probably going to go to college, which is great. College is awesome. I call that the list donut though. And it's because you've got a big hole in the middle, right? Like it has a lot of things to it. You've got the high end, you've got the low end, but it's missing a whole middle chunk. When I work with students and when I see students really happy at the end of the day, it's because they have a spectrum of schools where maybe you have a school that for that student is pretty reachy, but it's a really fantastic fit. And, there are really good reasons that they want to apply. And then it's kind of this blended color palette of admissibility all the way down to schools that we're really confident are going to be eager and aching to bring that student in. And in an ideal case, which is honestly, I'm super proud that this ends up being the case for the majority of my students, they can't pick a least favorite school. There might be schools that they're more or less excited about. There might be schools they're going to be extra bummed not to get into if they don't get into them. But they would be hard pressed to find a school on their list that they'd be like super bummed to go to. And that's what I want you to aspire to do, right? For your student, or for you, if you are a student watching this, you want to have that blended approach, and you want to make sure that selectivity is selectivity for you, because one school may be nearly impossible for one student, but pretty easy for another. And that doesn't mean anything about the quality of the school, actually. And I'm not going to go on that tangent. But the other thing I just want all of you to know is that you do want to be excited about every single college on your list. And think about it this way. There's 3,500 colleges in the country. So if you're applying to 10, those 10 should all be your favorite. Yeah. Oh, and I'll wrap it up with this because I know we want to be mindful of time. Although, if anybody else has questions, please pop them into your comments box. The last thing I kind of want to just touch on, if there aren't more questions, is just a reminder that the goal of all of this work and all of this introspection, and also all of your work throughout high school, is not to apply to college. That's not winning the race. Winning the race is being admitted to a nice handful of colleges so that you are the one in control of your final decision. The whole end goal is to attend college, to go to college, right? And that's an amazing end goal no matter where you end up. And I just want you to really focus into going to college, not applying to college.
Yeah, I think that's such an important distinction. A lot of people think that the happily ever after is at a certain point, and they forget like, oh, it's actually just to get into college and find a place where I'm valued and I love it and I love the classmates and the professors. It's really easy, I think, to lose sight of that goal.
Mm-hmm. Mhm. Wonderful. Well, as a group that's really trying to reach as many families and as many students as we possibly can to provide more information and better access to college and better understanding, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming. And thank you, James, for sharing your tremendous wisdom tonight. Thank you, all of you out there, for listening. And I'm hoping that you'll stay tuned for our next event, which is Live with Colledge: How to Show a College You're Really Into Them. And this is about demonstrated interest, which is something that's been on the rise the last couple of years in terms of its importance. We're going to have a guest speaker with our wonderful admissions colleagues over at Elon University, a wonderful, tremendous school over in the Carolinas, coming up on Sunday, July 10th at 6 p.m. I'm going to go ahead and throw that Eventbrite link for all of you to sign up into the chat right now. And I just want to say thank you and reach out if you need any more help. And hopefully you've gotten some great information tonight.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Mm-hmm.